Hey everyone, welcome to Bible 365. I'm Kathy Carter and I'm bringing you Luke 23 today. This is actually part one. There's so much content that I'm cutting it in half to keep it short. But this is part one. And in part one, I'm discussing what it looks like to be truthful when we follow Jesus, to give up power, to not try and be the most important person in the room, to not always get our way. And what does that mean? Like, according to truth, what does that mean in our hearts? What are you willing to put aside in order to love the Lord? So I want you to stick with me, and I will see you guys in a minute. Hey, welcome to Bible 365. I'm your host, Kathy Carter, and this channel is here to kind of merge Bible living with Bible literacy. So we are going to be using the New Testament this year in order to understand what it's like to live as a follower of Christ. I have a link below in the description that I have a download that will bring you to a chronological Bible reading of the New Testament. So what I want you to do is read every day and join me and hopefully some friends as we talk about what it means to live as a kingdom builder. Let's get started. All right. Hey guys, welcome. So I'm very excited to be out back again. I love being out back and enjoying the sun. It also gives me more space to breathe and less people to bother with all my recordings. But so today we're in Luke 23. So hopefully you've been with me before. My little bit of history is always on the kind of just the past chapter or so where we've been. And so we find that Jesus was arrested and he wasn't standing up for himself. And they were all the Israelites in front of him were kind of freaking out. They realized at a point that he was saying that he was God. He was saying that he was the Messiah, and they couldn't have it. They didn't want to believe him. They didn't want him to tell other people. They didn't want riots to start. They weren't ready. And so they brought him in, obviously, and they arrested him because of Judas. And so now they have him in trial. So they couldn't do anything. They couldn't put him to death, which is essentially what they wanted. So they needed to take him to the Roman government. And the Roman government would have been willing to put him to death. They are, and I've probably said this a few times in this kind of the same exact way, they're in this precarious balance, Israel and Rome. So Israel is very technically in charge. They are a superpower. They are running this whole area. Israel is they're seen as a lesser person. So some of them would probably be slaves to the Roman people, but for the most part, they are a nation that is separate from Rome. So they're under Rome, but they're separate from Rome, and they're kind of sort of able to govern themselves. However, they have this team that kind of meets with Rome, and so they govern themselves, but they're completely under the rule of Rome. And if they don't step out of line too much, Rome doesn't have to come in and take care of anything, and they don't really want to go to Rome for anything, right? They kind of want to handle everything in-house. They can't handle Jesus in-house because what they want to happen to Jesus, they're not able to do. They can't prove that he's guilty of anything that deserves death, which of course he's not, because he's God and he followed all of the rules and he wasn't sinful and he did all of the sacrifices and everything that he was supposed to do. So because of all those things, the Jewish people have no power over him to do what they want to do, which is essentially eradicate not just him, but him and the entire movement behind him. So what they're doing is they're passing it to Rome. Hey, we want to keep our hands clean and we want Rome to take care of it. So they kind of like pretend like they love Rome and they go hand him over to Rome. So here we go. It says the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. So again, I'm going to say kind of the hand of Rome. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Some of those things were true. Some of those things were a lie. So he did say he was Christ, a king. He did, in a lot of ways, openly admit that he was the king of the Jewish people. That he and this would have been the thing that would push up against Rome and Caesar, right? Well, he's saying he's king. You guys are just lowly Jewish people, and he's coming out and he's saying he's a king. Now, for them, he was the wrong king. So he wasn't a king that could overtake Caesar. So although he's speaking truth, that's not the truth they wanted to hear because he wasn't the right king for them. They wanted a David, right? They wanted a David to come in wipe everybody out, for them to be victorious over the entire nation, and for them to rule, because that was one of the things that they were promised. That was not the kind of king Jesus came as. So they were like, he's saying he's king. He's clearly not king. And I know that's offensive to you, Rome. I know that would be offensive to Caesar. So we're putting that one on our checklist of him, things that he's doing wrong. They also said that he was forbidding people to pay taxes, which we know through reading all of this, he was clearly not doing. So they did say, like, they dripped in some truth, much like Satan in many, many of the things he did, right? If we go back to two really obvious cases. So if we go back to the Garden of Eden, he said, did he say that? Right? So he kind of like dripped in, and then he said, he doesn't want you to eat that fruit because you're going to be like him. So he drips, you're going to understand the knowledge of good and evil, and you're going to be like God. So he drips in some truth, also feeding on what it is that they most desire in order for them to turn towards him and turn away from God. So God told us the truth. The other place that he did it was when Jesus was on that 40-day walk in the wilderness, and Satan would say some things that were true. Well, you can turn this rock into bread. Why wouldn't you do that, right? So he leaves like he's a liar. So I want to be clear, because he's a liar, but he's a liar in, which is really funny, because this is how we lie also. So sometimes we outright lie, right? Like sometimes we'll be like, I didn't do that when I clearly did. But sometimes we manipulate. Right? We manipulate the word of God. We manipulate, even, let's just even take out anything that is related to God or Christ or anything like that. We just manipulate because we're like, well, I didn't completely do my work, right? I work in a school. So these are kind of things I go to. I didn't finish, but she said I didn't really have to finish. Well, no, she said you didn't have to finish tonight, but you had to finish tomorrow. Right? Or she said you didn't have to finish right now, but you have to finish tonight. So these are like, some of them are lies by omission. Some of them are lies by just a subtle manipulation of words. Some of them are lies by leaving out truth. I mean, we see this in our political climate all the time. We see someone will post an image of someone with a grouchy face and say how angry they were, when somebody else will be in that same talk and post a smiling face and say how amazing the day went, right? So like, all of these subtle manipulations, and these manipulations are meant to turn us away from the truth. And we could be turned away from the truth for any number of reasons. Some of the most basic reason is to protect ourselves. I want to turn my audience, right? I want to persuade my audience of a different truth, because then I don't get in as much trouble. So I'm trying to persuade you of something slightly off in order that I don't get in trouble. Or I'm trying to persuade you because I want something. And so because of that thing that I want, I'm trying to persuade you in the way to get the thing that I want. So we are susceptible to these things. And by the way, those of us, those of you, those of us who believe you are not that susceptible to it are probably twice as susceptible, because you're so convinced that you're not susceptible to it, that you're actually completely open to letting these things come in. We are all susceptible to it based on our own flesh, based on our own sin, based on our own desires. So if, I'm watching a political news channel, again, an easy one, a political news channel that in general I agree with, I will more likely walk away agreeing with the opinion of the host. If I'm watching something I completely disagree with, right? Like in general, like even data that I completely disagree with, I will more likely disagree with a host, even if I'm confronted by certain things, right? Like we can go back, for anyone watching, you lived through COVID. And so we can even go back to COVID. If we go pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, you could find research to support both of those things. The chances are that if you were anti-vaccine, you weren't actively looking for things that supported vaccines and going, maybe this is good. You were more likely actively looking for things that were anti-vaccine so you could post them on social media. This is just the way that we're wired, and we could ignore the way that we're wired. We could deny the way that we're wired, or we can openly admit that there is some truth to that. And these are the things that we need to seek out to God. So this is what, coming all the way back to the idea of these Jewish leaders, were stretching the truth, we're exaggerating the truth, and we're outright lying in order to get him to get convicted. And it's super easy for us to point a finger and be like, can you believe that they would do this? How horrible. Instead of going, oh my gosh, I have been the victim of this, and I have done this. I have manipulated to get my way in my anger, in my fear, in my desire, right? In my excitement for certain things. And so all the way back to going to, this is what they did. This is what they did with Pilate. And Pilate was like, guys, I don't really see it. So here we go. So he says, they kept asking him, and he really didn't find any fault in him. And then they were like, well, he started this all the way over in Galilee. And he was like, this guy's a Galilean. Let's get rid of him. Right. And by let's get rid of him, he was like, I'm not a Galilean, so I can have somebody else handle him. Let's send him to Herod. Maybe Herod will do your bidding. And again, this is a weakness on the part of Pilate. And I don't want to bash Pilate too much because this is all about seeing it in us, right? It's a weakness in Pilate because Pilate didn't want to handle it. Pilate believed that there was nothing in Jesus that he could try against him. He said, there's nothing I can do for you guys. And instead of pushing up against the Jewish leaders and saying, I'm not handling this, right? Like, you came to me, you wanted A, I told you A wasn't possible, and now I'm sending him home. Instead of doing that, in his fear, in his, I don't know, gullibility, in his just desire to pawn something off on someone, there could be any number of reasons, because we have any number of reasons why we do what we do. In any of those reasons, he decided, I'm going to send him to Herod, and I'm going to make Herod be the bad guy. So he goes to Herod, and they're accusing him with Herod, right? Like, Herod's there making fun of him. And Herod was actually like really excited to see him because Herod wanted this like super miracle. He wanted Jesus, like, oh, I've been hearing about him. If you remember, he heard about him and thought he was John the Baptist, come back again. And he was like, oh my gosh, I killed John the Baptist. How is he back again? And so he was hearing all about him, and he's a big leader. And so he was interested in meeting Jesus. So now he's like, cool, I finally get to meet Jesus. I'm going to make him perform a miracle. I'm going to make him do a healing. I'm going to make him, any number. I'm just going to get some wisdom off of him. All of these things. Well, when he gets there, Jesus isn't really responding too much. And so Herod asks him questions. But then after asking him questions, it says he treated him, the soldiers were treating him with contempt. They were mocking him. They dressed him in this robe because he called himself the King of the Jews. So they dressed him up. They mocked him. They made fun of him. And again, what better way to get a one up on people? So again, going back to our nature as our nature is. And again, if you think that you're not this kind of person, maybe this isn't your weakness, but a lot of times when we're in power, when we have power over someone, like we work so hard to get power over someone because we don't want to be the victim. And so we work so hard to get power over someone. And then when we do, we generally misuse it, right? So like when we generally, not always, but we generally misuse it. And so he has now power over him. And instead of going, I can't find anything in him, he's just not guilty, sending him back to Pilate. Instead, they mocked him. They dressed him up. They beat him. They made fun of him. And so they abused this guy who had already been beaten, was so weak and so disheveled, probably not the right word, but so disheveled that somebody had to carry his cross for him. And so he was so bad, and they still made fun of him. He couldn't even really defend himself. And so he said, then him and Pilate became friends. And then Pilate summons the chief priests, and he's like, 3 times he said, I can't punish this guy. I find no fault in him. So this power of 3 is really important. And again, whatever it is that you want to see in it, you'd have to be blind in order to not see it at all, right? Because we see that Jesus is in for 3 days. He says the sign that's coming is going to be the sign of Jonah. Jonah was in the whale for 3 days, right? So we see that Jonah was in the whale for 3 days. We see that Peter denied Christ 3 times, right? We see the 3 temptations of Satan. And so we see this number 3 over and over and over again. And again, it was denied 3 times. 3 times he said, I find no fault in this guy. I don't know how you can have more proof than him saying, I find no fault in him. And they said, Herod also finds no fault in him. What am I supposed to do with him? He hasn't done anything wrong according to the law of Rome. And then they cry out all together. And then he's like, I'll punish him though. Like, so, which I think is kind of even funnier because he's like, I'll punish him because he's a Jewish person. And so he's like, you can get your licks in, but I can't kill him because he hasn't done enough wrong in order for me to legally be bound to kill him. But I can beat him because I'm not really going to get in any trouble for that. And so they were considered so insignificant. And the Jewish people would rather give their power over to Rome just to get rid of Jesus. Like these are the things that I question, but I also know that in our nature we have these things residing inside of us. So they say no altogether. They're like, listen, we want you to crucify him, and we want you to bring back that guy that caused an insurrection, which would have been by Rome. This would have been the legal guy that they should have been killing. And he's like, no. We want you to release this guy, this really bad guy, this guy that did like really bad things. Let him go and then take Jesus instead. He's the one that we want to crucify. It says in verse 24, and Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but delivered Jesus to their will. That's where I'm ending today because I feel like it's enough time on this. And then I'm going to continue into Luke 23 next time. But this is where I'm finishing for today. So if you found this to be a blessing, and I am hoping, this is just one of those like sidebars that I'm really hoping that this isn't, when I start talking about some of these things, this isn't an idea of behavior as much as this really starts to change your heart, changes the way, like, what am I willing to do or not do? Am I following Christ in the way that I respond to situations? Or am I following, let's not even say another God, because we're not really there anymore, right? Am I following the God of my own desires, the God of my own will and in some ways destiny? Or am I following Jesus? And if I'm following Jesus, then I need to be truthful, right? I need to not cut corners. I need to be willing to not be in power. These are the things that I need to give up as a follower of Christ. Am I willing to do that in order to love and honor Jesus in all things? So hopefully this has been kind of like something for you to contemplate and pray about, maybe journal about, depending on what you do. In the meantime, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And I want you to keep reading, stay in Luke 23, and I will see you guys next time.